On behalf of the good fathers and brothers here at St. Paul's Monastery, I wish you all a blessed, a very happy solemnity of Christ the King. Also on their behalf, I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving this Thursday. Great celebration for us Americans, Thanksgiving. And as Americans, we often hear the expression separation of church and state. Now, the church agrees wholeheartedly with this fundamental principle of good governance, the separation of church and state. In fact, today's solemnity, the solemnity of Christ the King, represents a kind of liturgical celebration of that expression, the separation of church and state. You know, some mistakenly think that separation of church and state is meant to protect government from religious encroachment. But just the opposite is true. The notion of separation of church and state is meant to protect religion from government encroachment. You see, and we need that fundamental principle, you see, because the church has no way of imposing its will, but the government does. Think about it. The government has the power to levy tax and confiscate property. It has a police force to coerce and imprison. So if the church wishes to remain free of government manipulation, the state will have to respect this fundamental principle of good governance, the separation of church and state. And one of the ways that our government ensures separation of church and state is through, for example, tax exemption. Without tax exemption for the church, the government could easily impose confiscatory tax policies to control and manipulate religion, a temptation difficult for most governments to resist. Even now, elements in our government seek to undermine this fundamental principle of good governance, namely the separation of church and state, through, for example, regulations that require the church hospitals, for example, to perform abortions, or church employers to provide health care that covers abortion. Such regulations violate the separation of church and state. A notorious example of a form of government that does not respect this notion of separation of church and state is, for example, communism. China, for example, tightly controls all expression of religion. Anyone there in China who dares to resist government control of religion winds up arrested, tortured, or even killed. Yes, even in our modern times, in our modern age, the communist government of China persecutes Catholics simply for being Catholic. Historically, the notion of separation of church and state came not from governments, but from religion. Judaism was the first to introduce this fundamental notion of good governance. See, prior to Judaism, the king, or Pharaoh, was the head of the religion and was even considered as a god. Astoundingly, this notion of the head of the government being also the head of the church and even a god existed even into our modern age, as in the case of the Emperor of Japan prior to World War II. But with Judaism came a new notion, a separation of church and state. For the first time, in the history of the human race, the king was not the head of religion. In fact, the Jewish king was forbidden from leading liturgical rites. Moreover, the king had to obey the same laws as everyone else, including the Ten Commandments. For the Jews, the king was not above the law. Christianity inherited this fundamental notion of good governance from Judaism and adopted the separation of church and state and held fast to it for the first 16 centuries of the Christian era. But in the year 1525, that ended when England broke that tradition, when the King of England declared himself the supreme head of the church in England. And so ended, and other countries followed suit. And so ended the notion of separation of church and state. But for our country, for the United States of America, we respect the separation of church and state. Our country, in fact, is based on this fundamental principle of good governance. We seek to prevent, and the reason we have separation of church and state is because we seek to prevent the government from encroaching on religion. So important is this principle that it became the first of the Bill of Rights, which states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The Church, the Catholic Church, wholeheartedly agrees with this First Amendment to our Constitution. And so, in the year 1925, Pope Pius XI established today's feast, the Solemnity of Christ the King, precisely to support this notion of the separation of church and state. Pope Pius XI did so and instituted today's solemnity to counteract the spread of those forms of government that ignore this fundamental principle of good governance. Taking again communism. Pope Pius XI specifically was concerned about the spread of communism, which not only denied the separation of church and state, but in fact tried to replace religion with the government. And therein lies the danger. The danger when forms of government do not recognize this fundamental principle of separation of church and state. The underlying problem of communism and to some extent of socialism is that the government ends up replacing religion. State authority ends up replacing God's authority. As a result, right and wrong, morality, is based on whatever the state decides. But true morality should be based on religion. True morality should be based on religion because only contemplation of the highest good, God, ensures a consistent ethic. Communism and all those forms of government that deny separation of church and state base morality rather on government rules and regulations. With communism, for example, an ethic based on the good is replaced with an ethic based on the will of the king or leader. Our faith Our Christian faith teaches us that no form of government may replace the government that comes from above. Only God, the eternal Son of God, Jesus Christ, merits our complete allegiance. He is our King, and today we celebrate that truth. And to the extent that government leaders govern in accord with divine wisdom, they too merit our allegiance. Therefore, far from restricting religious discourse in the public sphere, the good principle of separation of church and state encourages it. We religious people should be in the public sphere, talking, expressing our views. Why? Because God's wisdom sets the standard of human goodness. Only when His wisdom governs human conduct are we truly good, is our society truly free. Any wisdom apart from divine wisdom inevitably leads to slavery. One only need witness how easily the media manipulates the masses when God's authority is ignored. Certainly, in a pluralistic society such as ours, we need to articulate our position in terms of reason. But divine wisdom aids human reason. It does not circumvent or diminish human reason or its importance. God created human reason, and He expects us to use it. But He doesn't expect us to use it apart from His wisdom, or even worse, in opposition to His wisdom. That would be unreasonable. Here in the Eucharist, Christ imparts His divine wisdom to us. Moreover, He gives us the grace we need to live in accord with His wisdom, to live under His authority. Such wisdom, such authority includes the forgiveness of sin. Christ is a merciful King who forgives our sins. And as we submit to His gentle, merciful, and wise governance, then we become free. We are truly free. Free in the truest sense, free from sin. And that freedom that we enjoy as Christians includes voicing our religiously based convictions in the public sphere. The separation of church and state secures that right. And society needs to hear us articulate God's wisdom. For the pursuit of happiness, for which this country stands, and which in a special way we celebrate this Thursday at Thanksgiving. Freedom and the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness for which this country stands ultimately finds its fulfillment only in that happiness that God has prepared for us in heaven from the beginning of the world.